looking at the physical activity guidelines, we want to be at 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity, or 75 to 150 per week of vigorous intensity aerobic activity.
Okay.
And then also there's resistance training on 2 days or more per week, but we'll skip the resistance.
For our conversations, don't skip your resistance training. That's important. But you're saying, say it again, 150 to 200 minutes?
150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity.
Okay, so if you're exercising 5 times a week, that's 30 minutes to 60 minutes a day.
Exactly. Or you could up the intensity a little bit, or you can do some combination of those two categories. So you might have a little bit of, like we said, you need to, if you're interested in doing some of those efforts, like the bear chasing efforts, the short sprints, the stuff that you can't make time, or the bear chasing you or whatever.
No, let's chase bears. That's more fun.
Yeah, and we chase the bear here on this show.
That's it.
Let's go. I like it.
New merch drop. Bear chasing shirts.
Yeah. There's the best way to have an overarching exercise program for yourself theoretically would be to cover the different efforts. You have some really hard stuff, you have some really easy stuff. And then based upon your goals, you do some, if you like running longer or biking longer, or you have aspirations to just do stuff that's not as taxing right away, then you're just going to be on a different end of the continuum than you would if you are just more interested in your sprint type efforts. It really does. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much. Whatever you can stick with is going to be best. So focus there. There are adaptations of both.
Okay.
And so anybody that tries to tell you like you need to do all high intensity if you want to see these mitochondrial benefits, or you need to do all high intensity if you want to whatever, put on muscle, like something like that. And then on the flip side, if somebody's like, if you can't run 10 miles and if that's not all you're doing and focusing on all this zone 2, then you're not going to be able to whatever.
You're going to have a heart attack.
Yeah. You have to,
I think
there's so many ways to do this.
I remember you saying one time to me, there's no wasted movement, something along those lines, that it doesn't matter what you're doing.
Right.
It's always going to be beneficial.
Exactly. And that's a good example of why something, again, like zone 2 would be attractive, because you can just accumulate this volume without having to think about it too much.
Yeah.
Like if you're just like, I'm feeling good, I want to do some activity, 30 minutes walking, boom. It didn't like, for a lot of people, or maybe that would be challenging for you at first, which is fine. But eventually like that just becomes something that you can kind of put into your physical 401k, you know, like you just bank those efforts.
Yeah. My wife and I do that all the time. It's a great time for us to just talk.
Yes.
Get away from kids. We can go talk and walk.
Exactly. And so getting back to what we said about the guidelines, how do you then, so we talked about moderate intensity and vigorous intensity. And so how do we quantify intensity? Like how do you explain intensity to a layperson who doesn't care, or to anybody who just was like, whatever, I thought zone 2, is that equal to moderate intensity or is that vigorous?
Right.
Here's where hopefully we can answer that. The guidelines use something called metabolic equivalence, or METs. All METs do is measure the energy cost of a given exercise. And so there's this whole compendium, this whole listing of exercises and movements and daily tasks and odd movements. Like you can go and look at this compendium and it'll basically give you a score based upon what that activity is. So as you can imagine, something seemingly more intense, like running a race, is going to have more of an energy cost than sitting still.
Right.
So it just gives you very explicit, reference points for each of those activities. So the value is determined by comparing the energy cost of the activity itself to the energy cost of sitting at rest. So sitting at rest, they'll just call it 1.
Okay.
It's just 1 MET. And so to make concrete use of that, if we look at a moderate intensity activity, which would be equivalent to 3 to 6 METs, so it's just 3 to 6 times higher than whatever you would be doing at rest.
Got it.
And so that's how they classify these scores. So for example, again, you can look at this compendium, this listing. I mean, there's like how much energy, the cost of like pooping is on there.
Wow.
The cost of like walking up your steps with a bag of food is on there. Like it has,
no kidding.
It has wild, like, yeah, all types of stuff.
What if like you have all of the bags of food because you don't want to take a second trip?
I think that's all. It might be on there.
That's every male.
That's right.
Every dad, every male, every husband. One trip.
No walk of shame.
One
thank you.
trip.
Yeah, like an act of, you know.
4 Mets for carrying all the grocery bags. I think.
It's very short though. It's a very short
High
amount of
intensity.
time.
Yeah. So instead of looking at, okay, how many minutes per week of moderate or vigorous activity do I need? They also have it framed as how many MET minutes of activity. So you would then multiply. So if you did a majority of your exercise at a 4, which would be like walking at 3 miles an hour or so. You think about like if you set the treadmill to 3 miles per hour, like if you have a feel for that, that's about what the energy, like the effort would be. If you did that, 100 minutes per week, boom, you have your MET minutes. And so it's 500 to 1,000 MET minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week. So there's so many ways, like, unfortunately, if you're not looking at this on a piece of paper,
it can get
a little like weird there. And I understand that. So I would encourage you to like look to physically read this stuff. But again, I think because a lot of the health outcomes that we looked at, the all-cause mortality risk, cardiovascular disease risk, a lot of those are looking at, okay, what were these MET levels of activity? Like what were these metabolic equivalents? That's how a lot of these studies are framed. So I think it helps to say to somebody, hey, let's talk about this in terms of METs versus zone 2. We're just kind of like, we're just kind of speaking in the language of what some of these studies are. But there are studies that also talk in terms of VO2 max.
Sure.
It's, METs are not the only marker here.
But you're saying that a lot of these studies are such that it's saying somebody who gets 500 MET minutes versus somebody who gets 20 MET minutes.
Yeah.
And that's how it's judging one outcome or another.
Right. It's just getting everybody kind of talking the same language.
Okay. All right. So in answer to Matt's question, do I need to run? The answer is, well, kind of, but not exactly. You need to be moving, and you need to be moving vigorously.
Yeah.
And if it's running or biking or swimming or whatever, you will be healthiest if you augment resistance training with cardiovascular training as well.
Yep. And I think one more layer there too would be if you are cognizant of heart rate, great. If you aren't, then that's fine too.
Right.
If you have both, even better. You can at least just learn about what these efforts are. So what I mean ultimately with that would be, let's just say you wanted to do a zone 2 effort. You just want to call it that. We'll just call it zone 2.
Right.
So realistically, 60, 70, 75% of max heart rate. Okay. You can estimate your max heart rate. It's just 220 minus age. It's not the most scientific estimate, but
it's a good estimate.
It'll give you a very crude estimate.
Guess, rather. Yeah.
60 to 75% of that would be your zone 2 range. Go out for your run or your bike ride, see how your heart rate responds, and measure that subjectively to how you're feeling. Were you exceeding the talk test that we mentioned? Like, if you were with a friend, were you able to keep up a conversation? Or were you huffing and puffing? Were your shoulders rising? Were you starting to just, starting to feel that like unsustainability? Like there's a million ways to know what that feels like, but use that compared to the heart rate data, because I'm sorry, there's times where I go out and run and my heart rate will kick to 150, 160, but I'm like grooving. Like I feel amazing.
Yeah.
My breathing is fairly well controlled. And it's like, well, what do? Like, does that mean I got to like slow down?
Yeah.
Well, no. Like what if I only have 45 minutes to run, and in order for me to kick my heart rate to 122.6, I'd have to slow down to a 12-minute pace. And I'm like, well, does that mean I'm anaerobic if I'm too fast? Am I hurting myself? Well, no. So don't get fixated and don't let anybody tell you that like as soon as you exit this zone 2, you're going to hurt yourself. It's too fatiguing. You wasted it. You're a goof.
Yeah.
Like don't feel like that because again, everybody's goals, time constraints, all that kind of stuff is different. Now on the flip side, if you're like, oh, I got this ankle thing, my Achilles is bothering me, my knee is swollen, I'm tired as heck, and you're able to go back through your stuff and say, you know what, I've been pushing all those runs pretty hard. Then I went from 40 minutes to 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and I didn't even check my intensity. I was just like burning through them because I was like a madman, you know?
Yeah.
You got to just look back, and that would be an instance where you could say, okay, maybe I bit off more than I could chew.
Right.
But it cuts both ways. Don't get discouraged if you're walking with your neighbor and your heart rate kicks to 150. It's not the freaking end of the world.
Right. And it's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
You want your heart rate to
you're still aerobic. Like you're still aerobic technically up to pretty high heart rates. Heart rate is just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
Again, you could be carrying kettlebells and your heart rate zips through the roof. But that doesn't mean that you really entered any sort of zone that could give you a cardiovascular benefit.
Right.
Like I'm giving this speech essentially, and my heart rate's probably 150, but I'm not realizing really any cardiovascular benefits from this.
I was actually thinking
saying?
about that because we were talking about sitting and doing nothing versus whatever levels of activity for the Mets. And I was thinking, well, we are just sitting, but we're talking and there's intensity in it and our brains are firing off fast and hard. And it's my heart rate is definitely not at a resting heart rate. So does this count?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, it's a proxy to effort and that's it. Now, I don't want to gloss over that. You know, you could also look at something like VO2 max. You could look at something like resting heart rate to measure your fitness improvements. Like if you're like, okay, I've been doing this for 6 months. Tell me if this is working. Is this working? I've got my Apple Watch on or my Fitbit. Well, you could look at your resting heart rate. And if it is lower than where you started, then your heart, that is a meaningful metric. That is a good thing, you know, but that's just, I guess, a different context for it. You know, it just shows that if your resting heart rate comes down, your heart is working not quite as hard to move the same amount of blood that it was previously. So that's just, just an example.
That's good. That makes sense. And I hope that helps, Matt. You need to go get on a treadmill or row a boat or something because it's good for you. And at whatever intensity, zone 2 or above, get as much as you can.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And there's also there's nothing wrong with, I don't know. I see a lot of people joining a gym and it's all classes and it's all kettlebells and it's a million different implements.
Right.
And it's like, well, they got my heart rate up. Like, wasn't that good enough? Well, this is a prime opportunity to just say that as boring as they are, the single modality sort of things, the monostructural movements like a rower or a bike, walking, jogging, just you think about your swimming, very simple-ish movements. Yeah. Those are the places where it's easiest to realize the cardiovascular benefit. Yeah. You're in control of most of the variables, especially with the sprint, even the sprint type efforts too. Like you're much better off if you're trying to do some high intensity stuff. You can do it a million ways, but especially early on, if you have a bike, it's easier to do it that way than all right, I got a climbing rope, a kettlebells, I have bear crawls and burpees.
And I have to incorporate all of that in one exercise.
That's cool. That's cool in and of itself. Do that stuff separately for fun. There's health benefits there, obviously, but sometimes doesn't have to be that complicated.
Just get moving. Love it.